This is the first interval, and an interval conveys the articulation of form. If you have a circle, the circle has an interior space, and it also has an exterior space. If I hold a blank page, and I hold this circle in front of the blank page, the form is discernible because of the context, the background of the page. An interval is a way to mark the defining articulation of the form, or as one would say, the interior space. So if I hold the page itself is not an interval. But if I make a circle in front of the page, the space inside of the fingers, inside of the ring, marks an interval. So that an interval is an articulate structure in the composition of form. Interval is the way in which the formless is incorporated into form. If we limit ourselves to identification as the bottom line in truth-finding, in verification, identification always precludes the interval, precludes the interiorization of the context of the space, in this case, the blank page. So that all intervals in this education, and there are 8 of them, form together a pattern of articulate space that is included within the form of the education being 8 12-part lecture sequences. In a way, if we took the 8 intervals, they would all be invisible spokes that come to the center of the expressed form of all the lectures. In ancient times, when men still understood how to hunt, traps were set for wild animals that had a hole dug in the ground. And around the hole would be a wicker or twig ensemble that would be a circle, and 8 sharp sticks would be driven through the thick wreath of twigs, all coming together in the center. And this would be placed over the hole. And some cord would be attached, like a handmade rope, to the wreath of twigs and affixed to some very heavy object like a log, so that when the wild animal stepped into the hole, it was not the hole that trapped it, but its own attempts to come out of the hole. Its own attempts would be thwarted by all of the radio stakes that would then affix the wreath and the attendant log onto the leg of the beast. And one would be able to track or trap very easily this kind of beast. In a benign way, the 8 intervals of this course are what hold the education to you. And your attempts to not use the intervals, to not use the invisible structure, your attempts to forget about them, your inadvertent abuse of the mysterious is what is the glue that confirms that the education will never leave you, that you will carry it with you, But unlike a log that slows you down, the education will give you wings and will speed you up and buoy you. So I'm using an old hunting, a Paleolithic hunting technique to make sure that the education stays with you and sticks with you. This is different from instruction. And an education done this way is known as wisdom. For in this world, there is no way for us to not abuse the situation, to not abuse ourselves and others. In the popular joke that made the rounds in the 1980s, it's what Tarzan told Jane. It's a jungle out there. And indeed, it is a jungle. So this form of making sure that the intervals are the invisible structures by which the education will stay with you. So you do not have to make an attempt at all today or in the succeeding 7 intervals to memorize anything. You don't even have to pay attention. You can just simply be here, and I will deliver it in such a way that regardless of what you do to ignore it, it will be there for you and will cling to you and will work for you and buoy you up. Now, the first interval is characterized by a great Chinese classic. Its translated title, the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, was written about 500 BC, and the author, known as Li Er, of the Li family, gained such renown that all through the succeeding 2,500 years of Chinese history, many prominent figures whose surname was Li related themselves to Lao Tzu. The founders of the Tang dynasty in particular prided themselves on inheriting the mantle of wisdom of Lao Tzu. And Li Shimin, who became Tang Tai Tsung, loved the poet Li Po because he shared the same common name, spelled the same way. And in a peculiar way, Li Shimin, also known as the Son of Heaven, the great founder of the Tang dynasty, pointed out with great pride that his distant relative Li Po had blue eyes. Now, only once in my life did I ever see a Chinese with blue eyes, and I must say to you, it was startling beyond belief. I, at one time in my young life, lived in San Francisco's Chinatown, and on one cold, rainy morning, early, when the chickens in the crates were being unloaded by bandanaed, black singing youths, the only figure shuffling through the mist was an old Chinese man with a huge old brown overcoat pulled up and a pea cap pulled way down, and his wizened face with all the gnarled white hairs. And when he looked up at me as I passed him by, his sapphire blue eyes shocked me, and I was rooted to the place, my toes curled into the shoes, and they glued to the concrete. I had no idea of a blue-eyed Chinese, and indeed they are rare. But what Tang Tai Tsung meant about Li Po having blue eyes was that Li Po was born in the far west of China. He was born way out in the unforbidding desert regions. And yet those unforbidding desert regions of China in Chinese history are known as the Western Paradise. For the desert, the great expanse of the Gobi or the Taklamakan or the Tarim Basin, which is thousands of miles of nothing, worse than nothing, demon-haunted wastelands that, well, we'll talk about it later when we come to another great Chinese classic today, a commentary on the Tao Te Ching, commentary known as the Huainan will talk about the wastelands and how those who would like to be conspicuous in this jungle better stay in the jungle. For those who seek to be conspicuous on the jungle's terms should indeed fear the barren wastelands of nature. For there they are unprotected by the complications that keep them in power. And when those who are kept in power are taken out of that jungle and placed in nude nature, then all of the haunted ghosts that are there invisibly in the jungle become visible and haunt you indeed. Li Po was born in the far western paradise of China, and blue-eyed because of the genetic mixing of the ancient Tajik people. And those ancient Tajik people inhabited places like Kashgar and Khotan and Tashturgan, places on the mountainous far rim of China, of Irani descent. And in those most ancient times, Khotan was the center of a vast civilization. And Khotan was situated so that the great mountain range, the Kunlun mountain range, the mountain range that was always like the dragon, the great Kunlun mountain range that had as its most imposing peak Mustaga. And at about 21,000 feet, the flanks of this great mountain bleed off into two rivers that flow out of the mountain range, out of the Kunlun Mountains, and flow very close to each other, and the ancient city of Khotan is placed between these two rivers. And these two rivers are known as the White Jade River and the Black Jade River. And ancient Khotan was the only source in the whole world of jade, because the jade would crack from the rumble, the dragon movements of the Kunlun Mountains, and focus around the big hump of Mustaga, and bits of jade would be carried in the spring torrent down among the rocks. And one could not find jade by looking for it with the eyes, because jade is a celestial element. It's a structure of mysterious heavenly interval and cannot be seen by man in this world. And so it was fished for, as if it were fish. And it was fished for in the most miraculous, transforming, mysterious way. Women, barefooted, would gingerly walk in these stream beds at full flood, and with their toes were able to tell the difference between rock and jade. And the occasional piece of jade would be grabbed by the toes and brought out of the river. And this was the ancient source of jade in China. This jade became the symbol of a mysterious renewal of life and became the archetypal foundation for the Zhou dynasty, when the Zhou dynasty replaced the Shang about 1100 BC. The glorious splendor of the men and women of Zhou was contrasted to the old tawdriness, worn out of the Shang, because the Shang had based themselves on the power of muscles embodied in bronze, and that the bronze cauldron, the bronze ting of the Shang was the symbol of their power, whereas the Zhou that displaced them without a whimper, about 1100 BC, said not bronze, but jade is the symbol of a new dynasty. That the Shang had replaced the Xia, the most ancient first dynasty in China, because of the comprehensive symbolic power of bronze. But that now that jade was understood, the Zhou with their jade would replace the Shang, and they did. Lao Tzu lived in a century where the power of the Zhou had decayed to such an extent that the period is no longer referred to in Chinese history as the Zhou, though technically it was the Zhou dynasty still, but it's referred to as the period of warring states, of political intrigue that looked like a Machiavellian epic, of petty little warlords sprinkled like coarse pepper throughout the landscape instead of a kingdom. For the old Zhou had set their capital in the far west of China. The Shang had had their capital at Anyang, in the fertile rice-growing areas of China in the north. But the Zhou set their capital at Chang'an, on the Wei River, out in the west, in Shenxi. The gateway to the far west, the gateway to the paradise, the gateway to the ancient way in which one came by jade. In the period of the warring states when Lao Tzu lived, he was the archivist. He was the librarian for one of the great warlords of the time. And he lived long enough, he read enough, he thought enough, like the great phrase in one of the American poet Wallace Stevens' poems, the philosopher's man, the man who has had time to think enough, came to understand that there was a rhythm which included intervals to life, and that all developments in life have an articulate rhythm, a pattern, a resonance, and that it is the resonance that one must follow in order to understand the form. And the resonance is articulated by interval. It is the resonance plus the interval that gives you the music. Without the correct interval, there is no way to pace the resonance, and you have only noise. You have only the cacophony of the world. You have only the cry of the jungle, and not the music of nature. Another American poet named William Carlos Williams entitled a volume one time, Desert Music. That in the solitudes of the desert, one learns that silence has an interval. It has a resonance. It has a rhythm. Desert music. And like Li Po, who understood the desert music, like Tang Tai Tsung, who understood the desert music, their great ancestor before them, Lao Tzu, understood desert music. And so when he retired, at a ripe old age of well over 100 years, retired from the archives, from the record keeping, from the books, he did not die, but he rode out into the West to disappear forever. And in the west of China, a long journey from Chang'an even, a place called Lanchao, where a great gate had been set up in ancient times, very ancient times, in pre-Xia times. And this Tamen, this gate, was the gate into nowhere. Because beyond this gate, China no longer occurred in any recognizable form. In fact, nothing occurred in any recognizable form. Only the vast, mysterious interval of the desert music of endless space. The Gobi Desert, the Tarim Basin, the Taklamakan Desert. Places where it has been so geologically long that rain has fallen, that the sand grains have settled into almost a loose crystalline form, so that the slightest earth vibration sends an electrical current through the sands and they crackle with static electricity. And one can hear great moans and sighs, and nothing is going on. For someone who knows desert music, this is called wu-wei, a not doing, which is not to say an inaction or a non-action. It is an occurrence of resonance of nature in some profound, mysterious way. In the West, when learning was still among people, rerum natura was the phrase. It's nature's way. Why does it happen? Because that's the way it is. Because nature is that way. Mysterious. In the great commentary, the Huainanzi, written about 350 years after Lao Tzu, after riding into the West, and the keeper of the great gate at Lanchao asked him, before he disappeared forever, to leave some wisdom for other men. And Lao Tzu dictated to him the 5,500 characters of the Tao Te Ching and rode off. Some 350 years later, when the great power of the Chinese was coming back together, in the first dynasty to occur for 1,000 years, the Han Chinese, in the midst of the Han Chinese power, the most brilliant men and women understood at that time that they needed to look back to the brilliance of the beginning and the great apex of power of the Zhou to understand how a dynasty is kept healthy. And they used as their textbooks the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu and the I Ching. For the I Ching had been the great symbolic book which the founders of the Zhou dynasty wrote. The origins of the I Ching had been with China for 2,000 years, but it had never been put into a book. Now one has to understand the power of a book. We're talking about a book. And we don't understand because we do not have the invisible articulation any longer that makes a book. We assume far too much. We can't even understand rainless desert sand, crackling with static electricity that sometimes sounds like the murmur of voices. You swear they're talking. It is the quartz crystal sand. And how mysterious this quartz crystal sand. For it is only quartz crystal sand that in the most ancient times was capable of carving jade. For jade, mysteriously, heaven's symbol, cannot be carved. It has to be abrased. And only quartz crystal sand abrases jade. And so in an odd way, the jade can only be shaped by the great desert context into which it emerges from the Kunlun Mountains. In the white and black jade rivers, the two versions, black jade being dark green and white jade all the other colors. Only quartz crystal sand was used as an abrasion. And in the Zhou dynasty, for the first time, one had jades that not only had abrased images on them or abrased shapes to them, but in the Zhou dynasty, when it was founded, when the I Ching was written, ladies and gentlemen, for the first time, Chinese jade had inscriptions. Inscribed jade, jade with language on it, is coterminous with the I Ching. And in order to inscribe language on jade, one must use a stylus which is jewel-tipped. For only a jewel, only a raw diamond is sharp enough. On the Mohs scale, it's 10. Jade being about 7.5, nephrite. Only a diamond stylus can inscribe finely, in fine enough form, language upon jade. And so inscribed jades occur at the time when men and women said, we have understood a completely new way in which the universe works. The universe in its natural way works by Wu Wei. But it also responds to a completely different order of working called Yu Wei. Yu Wei runs seemingly contrary to nature. Nature always integrates, and Wu Wei always is the mysterious articulation of integration. Whereas Yu Wei is differential. It always has a purpose which consciousness has woven back into the natural fabric. Reeds grow in nature. They never weave themselves into baskets. A woven basket is a sign of another energy in nature. A language jade was the symbol of a whole new Chinese dynasty. And when it was crumbling in the time of Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching was written holding a mirror up to the book, the I Ching. And the Tao Te Ching, in a way, is the rarest of all inscribed jades. It's the jade of the mind that's inscribed with invisible writing by using the deep, refined self as the diamond stylus to write that language. And it's there only in interval invisibility, invisible writing. There's nothing to see with the identifying eye. In order to read that language, one has to have a receptive ear, because you're not hearing something out there, but you're hearing the space in here. It's a language written on interior space rather than exterior ink. So one has to have a complete blank page ear in order to begin to hear anything at all. But the blankness of the page of the ear must have a texture of the harmonic ripples of resonance of the Tao in order to hear the language that's there, the desert music. This is a long ways away from instruction. It has nothing to do with intense weekends. Nothing whatsoever. There's a quality of mysteriousness in Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, that when one gets the flavor of it is startling, absolutely startling. When the Han Dynasty was remembering the power of the Zhou, they founded their capital again at Chang'an. They refurbished Chang'an. They built it up even better than before. We will not only be splendorous like the Zhou, but we will radiate that splendor out farther than ever before. The Zhou dynasty accepted the blessings of the far western paradise, whereas the Han Chinese, for the very first time, said, we will include that in China. And under the great Han Wu Ti, Han being the name of the dynasty, Wu, as in Wu Wei, being the beginning of the name of the emperor, Ti, meaning heavenly. The heavenly, mysterious Han emperor, who had 130,000 people who served him specifically. It was a big power. Not only sent embassies to the far west, but he sent, for the first time, the presence of the defining borders of China to the far west. And places like Kashgar, for the first time, became incorporated in a larger China. The entire space of Central Asia became familiar to the Chinese people as home. It's remarkably similar to the way in which the American psyche in the 19th century did an end run around British Empire power. Because British Empire power was founded upon ships that could go everywhere in the world. And the only ships that went more places than the British Navy were the American whaling ships. The British Navy only went to treaty ports along the coast of China, like Hong Kong. They only went to places on the coasts of colonies. But unlike the severely limited range of British naval power, American ships went everywhere on the face of the earth where there was ocean. They cruised all the mysterious latitudes and longitudes in wide open ocean that had no shores whatsoever. And after a couple of generations of this, the American psyche took in the oceans of the world like the Chinese had taken in the Gobi Desert. And by the time of Walt Whitman, the American psyche considered the entire planet familiar, including mainly that half the planet that was just wide open water with no shores. That's why Americans understand Tao. That's why Americans who inherit that understand the Chinese real good. When we look at the Tao Te Ching, when we look at that mind space that's been jewel carved with the language of a pristine symbolic vision, we come to the fact that by the Han Dynasty, the time of great Han Wu Ti, when he was extending the Chinese empire all the way out, one of his successors who should have taken the throne, but who was wise to the political machinations of court life, refused to take the throne as a political leader and instead retired to become a private scholar, like a Chinese Montaigne, and stayed in his walled garden home and invited the most spectacular, rare, eccentric intelligences of the Han Empire to come and share with him his beautiful garden estate, his wonderful appointed home. And Prince Liuan and his confreres discussed Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching year in, year out for decades. And they distilled out a 21-section book called the Book of the Prince of Huainan, the Huainan Tzu, which is a great cloud of intelligence that accompanies the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu and the Huainan Tzu go together like a body and a mind, like a psyche and a physical aspect, so that the psychophysical basis of Taoism in China is always the Tao Te Ching and the Huainan Tzu together. Any learned traditional Chinese master knows this. One might ask then a very interesting, very serious question. Why in all the world is there no translation of the Huainan Tzu into any Western language? As the cab drivers in New Jersey would say, what the hell's going on? Where are all these experts on Lao Tzu, on Taoism, on the Tao Te Ching, on the I Ching, on China? Where are these experts? Are they the ones setting foreign policy at a time of great crisis when the Taiwan Strait is a much more serious anvil than the Bay of Pigs ever was in terms of future nuclear war? Or are people bland and confident that somehow the jungle will always remain a jungle, that there's no such thing as a forest fire? Moot points. The 21st century will be determined largely by whether the Americans and Chinese understand each other. And if they don't, it's not going to be very nice. And if they do, it'll be very mysterious. There may not be much comedy in the 21st century, but there'll either be a lot of tragedy or a lot of mystery. One way to understand the Chinese is to understand that Lao Tzu is the dead average temperature of the Chinese psyche. It's the characteristic familiar health point. That if someone has the psychic temperature of Lao Tzu, immediately all things Chinese become intelligible. You don't have to guess at some inscrutable multiple choice question. You can immediately, on spontaneous response, be in tune, be in the harmonic, be calibrated to the resonance, be in touch with the interval of the great genius of the Chinese. Now, after a short break, we're going to come back. But let's seed what we're going to talk about when we come back after the break. Let's look at my translation of the 4th section of the Tao Te Ching. In the times of the Huainan Tzu, the sections were made. In the Han Dynasty, the sections of the Tao Te Ching were made such that one could take beads of gestalts of language instead of taking the waterfall flow of Lao Tzu's language, because out of Lao Tzu there was no punctuation, there were no chapters whatsoever. There was simply the elegant cascade of language, because that language was inscribed on the great mind symbol of jade called the B, spelled P-I in art books, pronounced with a B. The great symbol was a circle. The great Chinese Zhou symbol of the truth, of reality, was this B. A great flattened disc of jade with a hole in the center. And when this B, when this symbol resonates, it sends out in every molecule of its resonance the entirety of the B. It's the principle of the soliton. In contemporary physics, it's called the soliton. In contemporary astrophysics, it's called being able to get the spectrograph of a star without having to have the whole star. All one needs is the light from the star. And one doesn't need all the light from the star, just some of the light from the star. And remarkably little some of the light of the star. One photon of the star will contain the entire spectrograph of the star. One vibration of heaven contains in every stone of the universe the entirety of heaven. Because tau clings through invisible structures to the extant. Whatever exists has a unity. It has what is said in Lao Tzu, it has te. Te doesn't translate as virtue. That's English schoolboys raised on Latin texts of Tacitus. It doesn't mean virtue. It has nothing to do with the Latin gravitas. That you're important because, like Dr. Johnson, you can really sit there. You can lower your voice to great octaves in pontificate. It has nothing to do with that. Te means the oomph of oneness, which is the tone, the resonance of existence. And that all existence is a oneness because it carries Tao with it. That the zero is included in the one of existence. And so one can talk about a universe, not an omniverse, not a multiverse, not an identity verse. Universe. Here's how section 4, it's called, and each section in the Huainanzi times, in the Han times, was given a little characterization. 2 characters, a pair of characters. And the pair of characters read nuns, as in zero, as in nothing, as in empty. And the other one reads source. None's source. Reads like this in my translation. Then we'll take a break. Tao, empty, yet employing it, evidently never exhausted. Profound. Corresponds to the 10,000 things. Presence's ancestor. Blunts sharpness, unravels complications, modulates present light, resounds even dust to tranquility. Corresponds to similarity sustained. I don't know whose son seems heaven's own ancestor. Let's take a break. Occasionally, sections of the Huainanzi will find translation. A selection of 6 sections centering around chapter 11 appeared from the University of Hawaii Press under the published title, The Art of Rulership. Aldous Huxley's family, who did a series of publications under the impress of Shrine of Wisdom, Southern England, in the 30s, did this little History of Great Light selection. The most comprehensive translation so far is one by Evan Morgan, done also in the 1930s, and it's called Tao, the Great Luminant, Essays from Huainan Tzu, and it's been reprinted many times. Perhaps the most interesting, not from the Huxley clan or from a British scholar or from an American scholar, but published in Hong Kong University Press, is this book, simply entitled and misentitled Huainan Tzu, but appropriately subtitled Philosophical Synthesis in Early Han Thought. And I think synthesis here is a Hegelian weighted term, but the more profound Hegel, not at all a McTaggart style version of Hegel. For deep Hegelian understanding, thesis and antithesis are able to make a synthesis because there is an integral format to the way in which the articulation of the formation happens. For Hegel, it was that a spirit moving leaves in its wake a pattern which holds together a gestalt known as history. So that to the brilliant Hegel in Berlin, unlike his followers in various subsections of other cities, Hegel understood that there is a mysterious movement, the object of which is not discernible by any identification, but the resonant wake of it is discernible because it synthesizes. It permits synthesis in the universe. It allows for weaving to take place, and that means that somehow in the dialectics of the world, polarities are able to depolarize and become complementarities. For a synthesis assumes that complementation is possible. This is very Chinese. And though Hegel knew nothing of Chinese thought, next to nothing, his history of philosophy includes 2 or 3 paragraphs on Chinese thought that are completely wrong, totally naive. They won't do it all. The only Western thinker before the 19th century to even get a glimpse of the Chinese genius was Leibniz, whose little book on the natural theology of the Chinese is republished by the University of Hawaii Press. This book, published by Hong Kong University Press on Huainan Tzu, is on the 6th chapter. And the theme of the 6th chapter of the Huainan Tzu, which is a cloud of ingenious commentary on Lao Tzu, which is what we're talking about today, the Tao Te Ching. And the Huainan Tzu being the greatest Chinese commentary on the Tao Te Ching, because it takes in the full resonance in complete harmonic analysis of Lao Tzu. They were brilliant people. Not only Lao Tzu brilliant, but you have to have a brilliance that almost matches him, if not matching him, to understand. And those people around Prince Luan were that brilliant. The theme of this chapter, the Chinese term, the 2 characters, Kanying, it's translated as stimulus, response, resonance. Now, stimulus response is kind of like a Pavlovian behavioral psychology way of talking. The Chinese do not talk that way. But the idea gets across somewhat. Something calls out and something responds. And what responds has a resonance to what calls out, because what responds is related to what has called out. And the calling out would not occur if the resonance was not already there. Which means that the stimulus response, rather than being two different things, are two arcs on the same circle. And that all resonance is that there's a kinship. And any arcs on the same circle will always call out to each other. And if there are concentric circles, arcs on different circles in concentricity will call out to each other. And one can take any selection whatsoever and come up with an accurate harmonic. If you have a room full of violins and you play E flat on one violin, all of the violins in the room will resonate E flat because they're all tuned to the same scale. The Tao is the scale of the real. So everything that is legitimately in Te will also have as its calibration Tao. So that it does not matter what stimulus and what response. For if one is working with Tao presenced, they will find their own harmony. And so, chapter 6, dealing with Kan Ying. Translated title of chapter 6 of the Huainan Tzu, Peering into the Obscure. When one looks at the Tao Te Ching, it is obscure. And one cannot look to identify, one has to peer to get used to. For what you are looking at is looking at you. And there must be a mutual recognition in order for a cognition to occur. That is to say, recognition preempts cognition. And this is remarkably like Plato's theory of education. Remarkably hermetic. Remarkably Taoist. And assumes that all disparacy in the universe is revolvable out of disparacy into harmony by transformation. Anything that exists, though temporarily is out of step with something else, can be transformed back into step, back into phase, back into resonance, by reintegrating it into its Tao denomination. For all things, to the Chinese, are not simply things, but they are all ratios. And they all have a common denominator of Tao. And so when they're focused in the right fractal way, they're all related. Everything is related on the basis of a common denominator that transcends difference. Now, it's true that in educational realization by 1996, 90% of high school graduates cannot do fractions accurately, repeatedly. doesn't mean that you cannot learn to do them. And ratioing the real is learnable. So that the whole purpose behind the Tao Te Ching, like the whole purpose behind the I Ching, the whole purpose of setting up the Zhou dynasty or the Han dynasty or the Tang dynasty, which was the Tang dynasty located its capital again at Chang'an, just like the Han, just like the Zhou. And in order for the Tang founder, Li Shimin, to show his comprehension of what makes the Tang dynasty real on a scale that reached all the way from the Pacific Ocean into Iran some 1,400 years ago. The symbol for the Tang dynasty was the horse. And Tang Taizong's horse, like Alexander's Bucephalus, was grand, powerful animal that lent mobility. And the Chinese army in ancient times was like infantry with heavy bronze armor. And in Zhou times, one had archery beginning to occur. But in Tang times, the Chinese army was all cavalry, highly mobile, like Pony Express. They had garrisoned fresh horses spread out across the face of Asia so that a body of men could be sent like a wave across 10,000 miles of landscape and arrive on fresh mounts. So that the power of the Tang Chinese is proverbial. And their way stations and their methods of setting up. When the Tang dynasty fell into a civil war that fractured China and a third of its people were killed in 1 year, and it never quite recovered. When the Tang dynasty finally fell, and after the Sung dynasty came in and tried to culturally re-inhabit the spread of the Tang Chinese, they were unable to sustain it. But the people who kept the horse garrisons remembered the power of the Tang and how they worked. And when it came for the right moment, those people out in the Mongolian steppes of China who had the horses gathered under Genghis Khan and took over almost all the world. And their empire spread from Japan to France because of the power and mobility of the horse, which was taken from the Tang, which was taken from someone who understood stimulus-response resonance. For Li Shimin is one of the great figures in world history, not just China. Tang Taizong, the legends of which is that includes a journey to hell and back, because he was capable of everything, anything, whatever. All of this comes from mastering the Tao Te Ching, which means mastering the Huainan Zi at the same time. They go together. When we read a translation of Peering into the Obscure, chapter 6, which is all about resonance. Resonance is about peering into the obscure. Somehow the Tao Te Ching is about maintaining patiently a gaze of an interior gestalt long enough to let the mysterious invisible language on heavenly symbols occur to you and speak to you. This is being in tune with the Tao. Not looking to identify things out there, but looking to come into harmonic resonances with the universe, and thus all so-called things at the same time. This is masterful. Instead of being dutiful student, one is master of situation, completely different. And mastery of situation yields comprehension to one's action, for one's action is not reaching out with a hand, like with a bronze sword, but by reaching to all with a celestial symbol that resonates everywhere, and then being able to mount mobility in the world and carry it out on any scale to any place spontaneously. This becomes an ideal to the Chinese. And the Chinese intelligence about man's capabilities on earth have this kind of elan. Once entertaining in Canada, they were not allowed in the United States in 1970. I helped entertain 40 Chinese engineers from Beijing, and they could visit Canada, but they couldn't come to the United States at that time. And it was stunning to see them come off this bus that pulled up in the most swanky section of Calgary, Alberta. And when they came off, they were not short Chinese from the south. They were all tall, over 6 feet tall Chinese from the north, in black Mao costumes with little red star in the collar, close-cropped hair, looked like football team. And I was talking to one of the men, and I said, I understand that you are from Peking. And he held up a finger. He said, Beijing. For the Chinese psyche understands that there is an energetic elegance which is truthful to the real that cannot be forgotten. It's not arrogance. It's being in touch with the high energy. And Lao Tzu is the highest energy of the Chinese. He is the Beijing of the Chinese. There's no such thing as a polarity between Taoists and Confucianists, between Taoists and Buddhists, between Taoists and communists. My mentor wrote a book on the Taoist mastery of Zhou Enlai. And it was about how the young Zhou Enlai grew up in a household where there were 6 women who were dominant, and he had to learn as a little boy to weave his way and get his own way among 6 dominant women. He learned how to work with an incredibly complex mechanics of situation, and took that dynamic all the way to Paris as a university student and worked his way through a foreign society and learned how to deal with the West in Western ways, but as a Taoist. And then for 40 years was seemingly in the background to Mao Zedong, who seemed to be a god and seemed to be everything. And within a month of Mao Zedong's death, China was Zhou Enlai territory, not Maoist at all. And still is. Still is Zhou Enlai territory. Still is Taoist in the sense of knowing how Kan Ying, stimulus response resonance, composes permanently. The Huainan Zi is written down about 130 BC, and about 700 years later, when the very first principles of Chinese painting are written down, the 6 principles of painting have the very first principle, which is here from Kan Ying. That when you are painting, what you paint must be real in terms of its spirit, presence, resonance, energy. That's the wetting the finger in the Tao to orient your image to the way the wind is really blowing. Whatever is painted then is real. And Chinese landscape paintings are not pictures of nature. They are inner extensions of the essence of nature and harmonically more real than those mountains out there. So that the way to view a landscape scroll is not to keep it hanging, but under special circumstances when you're ready with the closest friend to sit, to peer into the obscure, you unroll a landscape and you take a journey together. And this was the glue that held Chinese civilization together so firmly that for 2,200 years it never veered off course. It was navigable in terms of a traditional ethic that survived the flux of even things like dynasty rises and falls. An old China hand one time in Berkeley, an Indian from a Madrasi. If you know anything about India, the Madrasis, Krishnamurti was a Madrasi. They're very precise. Ranbir Vora, who had studied under John King Fairbank at Harvard, told a beautiful story of how when the Qing dynasty fell in 1911 and the great Tao men there in what is now Red Square in Beijing, they were taking down the name of the Qing dynasty off the main gate into the Forbidden City, and the workmen were taking it off, and they were going to put it on the bonfire, and they started discussing among themselves and said, well, these guys were pretty tough, and they were around for a long time. They might be back. We better save their sign in case they come back. Well, let's stick it up in the gate. There's a space there. And so the workmen, not the managers, the workmen, lifted it up. The peasants lifted it up, and it wouldn't fit in. They set it back in the ground, and somebody reached up in there, and they pulled out the sign from the previous dynasty, the Ming, hundreds of years before. Those guys had the same thought. They saved the sign for that dynasty. When you're talking about China, you're talking about not monolithic, but you're talking about Kanying, about how the resonance is so characteristic you could not miss it. It's not that the Chinese are inscrutable, it's that their exactness is so precise we keep missing it. It's like that famous gunfight in one of Walt Disney's great moments back in the 40s when Karl Barks was drawing the Walt Disney comic books. They were really great. One of the great villains was Black Pete. And Black Pete was having a shootout with Donald Duck. And Donald Duck kept missing, and Black Pete kept missing. And so Black Pete said, "Stand still so I can hit you." And Donald Duck retorts, "Move around so you get in the way of my bullets." The Chinese are so not inscrutable. They are so fundamentally simply basic that moving around in a scattered Western way, we don't get it. That they're never communist. They're never even Qing or Manchu or Mongol or Yuan or Tang or Zhou. They're always Chinese. Precisely, exactly, recognizably. One of the great mysterious Buddhist symbols of East Asian civilization is the Japanese character for rice, which is distilled from the Chinese. And the Japanese character for rice includes the radical, which means 88, and has a section of it which means hand. It means that this rice has gone through 88 hands to come to you. It means that you eat today because of the cooperation of people that's ongoing. That is Chinese. And that the cooperation is that the energy movement is the same spirit. And that's why the resonances are always recognizable no matter where they are or when. So that the Chinese soul is a bell that always rings with the same resonance, no matter what the shape of the bell is. For the deepest shape of the bell is not the outline of the identifying shape, but it's the tone that the existent has. That the existent is more primordial as a cognitive factor than the boundaried outline of a thing. And the calipers that measures that calibration best is the Tao Te Ching. That's what it's for. It's an instrument, like a calipers, to teach you how to measure, how to calibrate resonance on scale of the universe. And that if you are tuned to the universe in this way, your activities, which even seemingly are supernatural, transcendent to nature, will not be something which goes off in mad areas, but reweaves in a differential way back through the structure of nature and complements it. So that man's nature includes a transcendent capability. Includes the alchemical transformation of nature within the farther reaches of what is natural, which means that Tao, being so mysterious, though it goes through a phase-form cycle, that phase-form cycle can be gone through frontwards or backwards. It's reversible. And when one makes that kind of a movement, that kind of a gesture, one recognizes, if you're familiar with movement at all, fundamental, universal, archaic movement analysis. If you get interested in this, a man named Labin even worked out a notation for universal movement. Labin notation was used by many early dancers like Ted Shawn and early 20th century dancers to work out how movement works. Movement that goes clockwise and before completing itself turns and goes counterclockwise. That kind of movement, as long as you do not complete a circle, that kind of movement is a perpetual motion, has a continuity without end, without boundary. For it carries with it the interval. And so a dance movement like in Kathakali, where in South India, where the Madrasi dance form really brought to great conclusion, when they're telling story like Ramayana's story is never over. It's an eternal story that is always being told. Rama and Lakshmi are always seeking to rescue Sita, who's always kidnapped by Ravana, and Hanuman is always aiding man. And all of this is always going on because motion of Ramayana story follows also this sinuosity of continuous movement. And that sinuosity of continuous movement is the energy that makes universal resonance harmonic on basis of Tao. So that when we come to Tao Te Ching, we come to section 37, the two characters at the beginning of it. One is a character for governing, like government, governing. The other one I've translated as busy. It means that intense movement. I translate it as busy governing. And 37, is the section that ends the section about Tao. Because the paired section to the section on Tao is the section on Te. For the Hainan Zhu people in 130 BC in China, when they were making this cloud of commentary, this clothing to go on the body of the Tao Te Ching, they cut the suit in such a way that not only were there 81 sections, but they fell into a pair of areas. One centered on the way Tao moves and becomes Te, and the other centered upon the way in which Te stills and becomes Tao. The way that movement and stillness are complementations. And at the end of the section on Tao, the Huainanzu people put the total number of characters for that section. And then at the end of the section on Te, they put the total number of characters for the section on Te, to permanently mark, like a mark on a liquor bottle, that nobody took a character away. There are 2,426 characters about Tao. And the last bunch of characters forms section 37, entitled Busy Governing, and it reads in translation, my translation, like this: Tao, eternal, non-doing. Yet nothing not done. Knights, kings, if they can keep this, the 10,000 things of themselves transform. Transform, yet when desire stirs, calm by non-name presence. Uncarved. The non-name presence, uncarved. In phase, will not desire, thereby still. Heaven, earth, being absorbed. In this motion of continuity, where one does not complete an identity, the nature, because an identity is not promulgated by polarity, carries over into a continued operation. If you completed the circle, that's all it would be then, a circle. But by continuing the operation, one is forever carrying over and continuing. It's just like if you add up a series of numbers and you have more numbers than what the single digit of a column of addition is, and you have to carry over to the next column. In the 5-phase energy cycle, as long as fullness is there, you're always carrying over into the next column, the next phase form, and the phase forms keep working. And they work because the universal articulation allows them to work that way. So one not only has 5-phase energy cycle, but it comes back into Tao without leaving a trace and continues to work and is continuity. This continuity is characteristic of nature. Nature is always, always continuous. Wu Wei then is a non-action by an external assessment of circumstance, but is universal action by Tao. Whatever you do is done Wu Wei, factored into the movement of continuity. But we are of such a nature that we are capable not only of wu-wei, we are capable of yu-wei, of transcendent motion that is supranatural. And it doesn't mean that it flies off the possibilities of nature. It means that it extends the possibilities of nature in a complementary way. Wu-wei always means that we have been factored into the integral energy motion of nature. We fit in nature. But man is capable not only of fitting in nature, but of being supernatural, of seemingly going counter to nature, but the counter movement is always a part of the larger continuity, as long as one does not punctuate it by terminalizing and fossilizing the energy flow into some identifiable this or that. Once existence is postulated into a this or that, then polarity characterizes. Then it's there. Then you have to deal with it as something there. But if the motion is kept in continuity, if whatever integration is happening is kept in the ongoing columns of the flow of Tao, then there is no limitation and transformation is possible at any moment, at any time. And any transformation anywhere yields the counter movement, yields the beyond nature. Except that beyond nature, instead of being integral, it's differential. Now, in this chapter 6, Peering into the Obscure, we read, in translation here, in ancient times, when Master Kuang played the White Snow Melody, the pipa, the Chinese lute, which is in the pentatonic scale, would be played in a melody. The melody, White Snow, is not perfectly recognizable now, but you can see that white snow is like continuously falling purity, that kind of quality. The greatest artist in Japan, Sesshu, who was able to paint a whole landscape scroll in one day, took as his name Sesshu, which means fresh snow. In East Asia, snow is always this quality, not of purity so much. White for Chinese means death. But the white snow is peculiar. Why would it be not purity, but a threatening thing like death, and yet Taoistically, mysteriously, something that one should inculcate in oneself? That's what this is all about. That Lao Tzu is all about this. And the Huainan Tzu, therefore, is all about this. And chapter 6, Peering at the Obscure, is all about this. That's why they're talking about the ancient music master, Master Kuang. When he played the White Snow Melody in his pipa, the ruler became afflicted with infirmity. The land of the state of Qin was scorched red. Now, when all this happens, the Hainan Tzu says, it's because when one concentrates essence and disciplines thought, discarding all concerns, gathering together spirit, they merge above the 9 heavens, and subtle essences come into play. That means that when the qing, the essences which occur in nature, are concentrated and brought together, they transform in such a way that the qi qing, the supra essences, are distilled and come out. That means that integration does not just statically reside there in identity, but go beyond into a transformable, beyond identity, beyond identification, beyond thing, a transcendence. And that this now occurs, and one has to take into consideration of this. So that when Master Kuang plays the white snow melody on his pipa and symbolically harmonizes all reality together, whatever is not in tune will crumble. And therefore, worldly people have good reason to beware of someone who has real wisdom, because someone who has real wisdom harmonizes, and everything that is out of harmony falls to ruin. Because the whole world then recalibrates its structure out of maintaining false appearances into harmonizing with what is real. And all the things that are illusionary fall into scorched earth, into crumbled structure. And so those who have a deep investment in maintaining the real estate of appearances do not like wisdom, do not like someone who can bring, like Master Kuang, the white snow melody into play. So that the Huinanzi says, now death and life share a common territory. It is impossible to intimidate a valorous soldier and deter him from becoming a hero to the three armies. Such a man seeks merely fame, and yet can bring himself to ignore death. How much more possible, then, for he who makes heaven and earth his palace, treasures in his heart the 10,000 things, befriends the creative transformations of yin-yang, cherishes perfect harmony, merely lodges temporarily in the human form, scrutinizes the 9 heavens and thus penetrates to the one, thereby coming to know the unknown. In his mind, he never undergoes death. This is the way the Huinanzi talks about the Tao Te Ching. The pearl of the Tao Te Ching has the scintillating, iridescent luster of the Huinanzi. And when one takes them together, one comes to understand deeper. One comes to penetrate. Tao, being zero base, is what it is. The saying in the 60s was, you don't have to push the river. It flows of its own nature. But something in existence, something in Te, something that is resonant with oneness, needs to be encouraged, needs to be educated, needs to be brought up, needs to be matured. Because it is changing, because it is transforming. And you must constantly, as it goes along in its phase form development, keep it tuned. The harmony of the universe needs no tuner. But as soon as you make an instrument, you have to keep it in tune. Otherwise, you cannot play the melody, and the chords will not harmonize. So, chapter 51, section 51 of the Tao Te Ching, the 2 characters at the beginning of it, one is Te, and the character before it is the character for nursing. Nursing, Te. Reads like this, my translation. Tao livingly presenced as Te, nourishes presence. Tao, livingly presenced as Te, nourishes presence. Real form itself. Energy completes presence. Notice, energy completes presence, not the form, but the presence that is vibronically coupled with form, so that there's an ongoing harmonic that occurs, so that there's a resonance, so that someone who is a music master and level of Master Kuang can hear what is real now, here, and can play in tune with that. But when he plays in tune with that, those who are out of step with what is here now, their structures of power fall by the wayside immediately. So it reads like this: Tao, livingly presenced as Te, nourishes presence, real form itself. Energy completes presence. Even the 10,000 things are unified. Not honored Tao without esteeming Te. Tao presenced honors Te's presence. In esteem, however, unified presence commands, but always as, and the Chinese characters here don't need to be translated because we have to learn to add this to the vocabulary like we add Tao or add Te. The pronunciation is Tzu Jian. It means self-so. It means mystic actuality. It means just so. In Platonic wisdom, when Socrates is making these large gestalts within which the dialogue has its real presence, and the argumentative form of whatever sophistic example is being discredited in a very subtle, elegant way, as soon as the sophistic form crumbles, all that one is left with is the realization of Socrates' context. And at this point, if someone gets it, like Phaedrus, then Socrates will say, in response to the characterization of the truth of what has been learned, he will say, just so. Later on, such a Buddhist Vajrayana master as Rudyard Kipling wrote a whole book called Just So Stories after he wrote that great mystic story called Kim. Oh yeah. You thought Rudyard Kipling was Victorian imperialist? Ha! So Nursing Te ends with this section. I'll read it, and this will be our presence of today. It reads this way: Thus, Tao's living existence is Te. Nourishes presence, raises presencing, nurtures the presence, completes presence, matures presence, rears presencing, protects presence, living but not to possess, making but not to claim, raising but not to rule. This is called profound Te. And at this point of the Tao Te Ching, the Huainan Su commentators put two characters on the next section, section 52, and they simply read, return to origin. Because that's all you can do at this point.